Okay, this is the final of the 3 Peerceptiv review videos. And before I show you the document in Peerceptiv and start applying the rubric to it, I wanted to show you this in the on Canvas. It's under the Peerceptiv review item in the calendar. It's on the assignment page, it's on the syllabus page, it's on the calendar. And wanted to just direct you to these ratings. So to assist you in assigning these ratings, I wanted to give you some qualitative information to go with the quantitative numbers. So these 4 ratings, excellent, good, fair, and poor, relate to the rating numbers 7, 5, 3, and 1. So you're only going to give something a 7 if this is so good that it's on par with Professor Norton's examples. And then you've included some comments about what you've learned from reading that work. Or something that particularly impressed you. A 5 means that it's really good with a few improvements, which you would describe in your comments. This would be an excellent submission. It's not quite there yet, but if you make the adjustments, it would absolutely be there. Fair, you've got the idea, but there are some significant revisions that would have to be made before this would approach excellence, and you detail those improvements in the comments. And then poor indicates that this doesn't significantly resemble anything that we've learned, that you can't really tie that to anything that was supposed to be written in the document. Now, ideally, you shouldn't be seeing any pours on a redraft because everyone has now been through a conference. You've had your rule explanations reviewed a couple of times. You've had a rule, an overview paragraph reviewed, a rule application reviewed, the full document reviewed. So at this point, nobody should be in the poor range. But certainly if you see something that doesn't resemble what it's supposed to, you need to give the person that feedback for 2 reasons. The first reason is that they need the feedback to improve. They're relying on your valid critique in order to make change, in order to improve their skills. The second is that you are graded on your reliable, valid, accurate review. And what we've discovered in Peerceptiv, the people who've used it, I've used it for a couple of years. Peerceptiv has been in use for about 10 to 15 years. It's been studied extensively, and what we find is that the crowd generally gets it right. And so if you deviate too much from the group, your score goes down. Now, of course, I can check that. If there are any anomalies, those get flagged for me and I can check and make sure. And if I need to override anything, I can certainly do that. But my experience is that students who are deviating from sort of the norm of what other students are giving a particular document really are having trouble understanding the concepts. So you really want to make sure that you give nice, good, fair feedback. It doesn't help the student you're reviewing if you give them 7s across the board, and it certainly doesn't help you to give them 7s across the board. So obviously you don't want to be nasty about it. You don't want to be overly critical, but being overly generous doesn't really serve a purpose here. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the review document. So I've got my rating screen up. I'm going to click this button over on the right and pop out the document. Now, this is a student submission on the initial redraft, and so that's why this has the highlighting in it. But the ones that you see, you should not see highlighting, and I'm going to reflect that in the comments so you can see how it is that you deal with deviations from the instructions. So the first section is format and appearance. It says that we're first going to look at margins, font, and length. So my recommendation when you're looking at these documents is do the ratings first and then come back and comment on anything that's not a 7. And even a 7, you want to comment on what you learned from looking at the document. So the document has 1-inch margins. Yes, that's good. In 12-point Times New Roman, that looks to be true, and does not exceed 3 pages. So it looks like we've got a winner there. That's going to be a 7. Paragraph break formatting. The paragraphs are not indented but are separated by an additional space. This is certainly true of this document, and so that's going to get a 7. If they had been separated by a space and indented, for example, you would give that a 5 because it's almost there, but it's not quite there. An adjustment would have to be made before it fit the instruction perfectly. The appropriate sections. The document contains a standard memo heading, so the word memorandum, to, from, RE, and date. A discussion section. This one has a discussion section. And a conclusion section. And this has a, whoops, let me get to the end again. Has a conclusion section. So this one fits the instruction perfectly. If, for example, the conclusion label had been left off, or if the discussion label, or both of them had been left off, then you might want to give that a 5. So that's how you'd rate that. No highlighting or labeling. Well, this criteria says there's no highlighting or labeling beyond the heading and the discussion sections. Well, this has highlighting throughout. So I'm going to say fair on that one, because the whole criteria is there's no highlighting. And this has highlighting, but it doesn't have the labeling. It's not labeled overview, explanation, etc. So it doesn't completely fail to follow the instruction, but it's not, it doesn't represent a good following of the instruction, so we'd give that a fair. Now, you've given one criteria a fair and all the others are 7s. You don't need to worry so much about hurting someone's overall score. First of all, the algorithm is pretty complex, and so an individual's ability to affect somebody's score higher or lower is pretty minimal. I mean, unless you are a math and statistics savant, then it's unlikely that you're going to be able to tweak this effectively to get a particular result for a student, and even less likely that you're going to know who the student is. So just give fair, honest feedback, and they will benefit from your honesty, and you will benefit in your score from your honesty. Okay, so the only thing that was off base there on the format and appearance was the highlighting. Remember that the second draft was not to be highlighted. This was the only issue I saw with formatting. Okay, so that gives a nice specific instruction. Here's exactly why it is that I'm giving you these ratings. Roadmap paragraph. Conclusion in the first sentence. Clyde Beckwith will likely not be convicted of burglary in the 2nd degree. Perfect. The writer has set out the general rule, quoting the applicable statutory sections and quoting or paraphrasing the common law or synthesized rule. So we have the statute, and it's quoted exactly. It is edited exactly the way I edited the one in my document. And so that's a perfect edit of that. Let's see. And then mixed-use building is a dwelling, so we've got the cases cited there. Now, there is an issue with these cases, but this is not something I want you to worry about. I want you to worry about whether things are cited, so for example, citation placement, but I don't want you to concern yourself with the format of the citations. That's something I'll look at when I review the drafts. But this one is, the issue with the citations is that this actually cites the lower courts in each of these cases. So these are all First Department sites, but the information used by the author from these cases all came from the Court of Appeals case. So the Court of Appeals site is what you really wanted, and I addressed that in office hours last week, that there were some people that I saw where they were getting that from in the document and pointed that out. But the fact is, the general rule is set out. It's the statutory sections are quoted, and the common law rule is paraphrased. So that's excellent. The writer has not included unnecessary disjunctive options from the statute. That's absolutely true. There were several ways you could demonstrate that something should be elevated from 3rd degree to 2nd degree burglary, and the only one that's relevant in this case is that the building is a dwelling, and the statute is edited to reflect that. Citation placement. For each rule stated, the writer has included a citation to authority. Again, you want to concern yourself with whether there is a citation. You don't want to worry about whether it's a correct citation. Okay, so that is excellent. Okay, very nice job of the overview paragraph. It was easy to understand and well laid out. Congratulations on nice work. Okay. Okay, so we move on from there to the rule explanation. So before you can rate the rule explanations, you're going to read all of the rule explanation paragraphs. Here you can tell from the, looks like you can tell from the side, from the highlighting that there are two rule explanation paragraphs. So a required element in determining if a mixed-use building is a dwelling is that it is usually occupied. Excellent. So that one starts with a rule thesis. In People versus Quattlebaum, the defendant wrongfully entered the first floor offices of a school. That's a fact. That's the next thing that should be in the explanation, that the facts follow the rule. The court considered both the frequency of the building's use for overnight stays and the overall character of the building in their assessment. So now we're getting into the rationale and the holding. Whoops. I don't know why that does that sometimes. The rationale and the holding. When the building was in use, it was used as a school, and it was generally recognized that the fifth floor was used as an office. The court further indicated that a room used for overnight stays less than 30 times per year does not establish usual occupancy. So that's all rationale, and the rationale follows the facts. Therefore, the court held that the mixed-use building did not constitute a dwelling, and Mr. Quattlebaum should not be charged with burglary in the second degree. Okay, so generally speaking, our rule thesis statement was there, and it was good. Facts followed the rule. That's excellent. The facts were followed by the rationale and holding. The only issue here is that the holding is not appropriately narrow. So the court held that the mixed-use building did not constitute a dwelling, and Mr. Quattlebaum should not be charged with burglary in the second degree. The topic of this paragraph is whether it was usually occupied overnight. So the conclusion should state whether the court held that this was usually occupied overnight, and that's not included in that statement at all. So I would go with fair on that one, because even though it does give the holding's in the right place, and it doesn't focus on something wildly different like intent to commit a crime or another element, it doesn't zero down into usual occupation. It stays at a higher level of abstraction, talking about whether it was a dwelling, whether it was burglary in the second degree. So I would give that one a fair. The clarity of the rule explanation overall, I thought it was very clear. I thought it flowed well. I thought it was thorough. Citation placement, is there a citation after every single sentence? So after the first sentence, yes. After the second one, yes. Third, yes. Fourth, yes. Fifth, yes. Sixth, yes. Very good. So there is a citation after every single sentence. That is excellent. Okay. So those are my basic ratings for the rule explanation. Now I'm going to look at the second rule explanation and see if that changes. Factors to be considered when determining if a mixed-use building is a dwelling are the size, the remoteness, and the accessibility. There is a rule thesis here. The rule thesis could relate itself a little bit more closely to the threat of violence, but this is a valid rule. So I'm going to say with excellent. Facts follow the rule. In People v. Joseph, the defendant wrongfully entered the basement. The basement could only be accessed through 2 cellar doors and a set of stairs from the sidewalk, and there was no access from the basement to any other area of the building. So the facts follow the rule. Again, excellent. The court held that because, so this is going to give us court rationale, because the basement was both isolated and inaccessible from the dwelling units, the building did not constitute a dwelling, and the evidence was insufficient to support a conviction of second-degree burglary. So this does relate to inaccessibility and the remoteness, whether it was isolated. It doesn't stop there. It should really stop there and not expand out to dwelling and second-degree burglary. So I would say this one is a good, and I would say in conjunction with the other one, I would say when you consider them together, I'd give that one the benefit of the doubt and say, yeah, the holdings are generally appropriately narrow, but they could certainly be fixed. Clarity of rule explanation. Again, I thought this was very clear. Citation placement is excellent. There's a citation after every single sentence. And so it looks like that's all I have on rule explanation. So my one comment is going to be, overall, these are well-written rule explanation paragraphs. However, remember to keep the holding of the case narrowed to the rule in the rule thesis sentence at the beginning. For example, the first rule explanation paragraph should have ended with a holding about whether the office, or whether the building was usually occupied overnight, rather than the broader concept of whether it was a dwelling. Yeah. So that's good specific feedback. That tells the reader not just what's wrong with it, but it tells the reader how to fix it. So this is what you would have to do to fix this issue. So that's good, clear feedback that's going to get you nice back evaluations. The back evaluations, all of you are grown-ups. All of you can take some criticism. So you're not going to get bad back evaluation scores simply because someone gave you valid criticism. What I've seen mostly is that bad back evaluation scores come from not giving specific criticism or not really giving any valuable feedback. Just 7s across the board. And that doesn't really tell you anything about how you did and how you might improve. Okay, next are rule application paragraphs. So we've got Mr. Beckwith wrongfully entered a building which included 2 apartments that were usually occupied. Okay, so the issue with this one is that this first statement, wrongfully entered because are usually occupied. Yeah, I think that's a valid conclusion there. It doesn't identify whose position that is, but it does say that they're usually occupied. I think it would be clearer if they started with the prosecution would argue. And in fact, the first criteria is that you give the identity of the party. So it begins with a reference to the party whose analysis is reflected and contains the party's conclusion on the element discussed. So it does have the conclusion that they were usually occupied, but it doesn't identify this as the prosecution's conclusion. So I would say good on that one. It's a small tweak, and so it's easy to fix. So that gets a 5. Fact-to-fact comparisons or distinctions. Unlike Mr. Quattlebaum, who entered a building that included an office occasionally used for overnight stays, Mr. Beckwith broke into a building with 2 residential apartments. So there's a comparison. Quattlebaum entered a building that had an office occasionally used, whereas Beckwith broke into a building with actual residences. Whereas in Quattlebaum, the overall character of the building was that of a school with an office that was primarily used as an office, the character of the building in Beckwith is that of retail space with residential apartments that are primarily used as living and sleeping spaces and therefore usually occupied. So those are great. That's plenty for usual occupation overnight. It gives clear comparisons, and the reader isn't left to put any information together. So I'm going to go excellent on that one. The significance of the comparisons and distinctions. There could be better statements of significance indicating why it matters that one was an office and one was a residence. There's some reference to why it matters in the statement about the overall character of the building. Like, that's why it matters that one of those serves primarily as an office and one of those serves primarily as a residence. And so that matters. So I would say, again, I'm going to go with good on the statements of significance. Thorough analysis. The analysis is thorough, including a discussion of all applicable factors in all applicable cases. Absolutely. There's only Quattlebaum here, and Quattlebaum really only talks about the character and the nature of the building when we're talking about use for overnight lodging. The application covers both parties. Yes, there's a prosecution and a defense. So I'm going to give an excellent on that one. And then a mini conclusion. The court will likely find that. So that's good. Excellent. Now I'm going to go back and look at these paragraphs and see if it changes my mind any about the comparisons or the conclusion sentences at the beginning. The defense will argue that the 2 apartments located in the building Mr. Beckwith entered were not usually occupied. Okay, so that's a good, clear conclusion that relates itself to a particular party, so that's great. Similar to Quattlebaum, in which the office was not in use at the time of the burglary, neither were the apartments in Beckwith. So you're saying neither one was in use. Like in Quattlebaum, where the office was only occasionally being used for overnight stays, one of the apartments in Beckwith was vacant for 8 months due to renovation, and hence occupied for less time than it was unoccupied. So again, very express comparisons. Now, on the model memos, I talked about the fact that the defense could really concede here because the defense doesn't need this to win, and it's a much harder argument to make and may not pass the smell test for a lot of judges and juries. However, this makes some very good points. These are not ridiculous arguments. This is not a stretch. And so this is a perfectly good argument for the defense to make. So there's nothing in there that makes me change my analysis. So as I go through and look at the applications for the next set of criteria, Mr. Beckwith wrongfully entered. So again, it talks about accessibility, which is good. I would like for it to mention the threat of violence, but it's okay that it doesn't. He wrongfully entered, but it doesn't tell from whose point of view this paragraph is. So again, I'm going to stick with my good rating on conclusion and identity of party. Unlike in Joseph, where the defendant broke into a 7-story building, Mr. Beckwith entered a smaller building consisting of only 2 stories. Nice comparison. Whereas Mr. Joseph entered the basement, which was separated from the sleeping quarters by a deli, the sleeping quarters in Beckwith are directly above the ground level pizzeria broken into by Mr. Beckwith. A nice contrast. In fact, both of those are contrast. Whereas Mr. Joseph would have to exit the basement via stairs to the street level, re-enter the building, and take a second set of stairs to reach the sleeping areas, Mr. Beckwith would simply have to exit the pizzeria, re-enter the building, and take a single set of stairs to the apartments, giving him easy access to the residential apartments. Okay. The only flaw with this is that only one case is used here, and this would be a much stronger analysis if you had those bookend cases of Joseph and McRae. And so Joseph and McRae would have been stronger than just Joseph or McRae. I do realize that's a decision that a lot of folks made based on space, but as you saw from the model memos, you can actually get it all in there in 3 pages. You have to write very concisely and have it very streamlined, which this draft generally is. So I think there could have been room made for McRae here, and that would have made it stronger. Nonetheless, as far as just the structure of the application paragraphs, they are structured well. They make good comparisons and distinctions. They use the case law that's presented, and they start with a strong conclusion. So I'm going to say again that the significance, I would say overall, all things considered, I think it's really very good. I don't know that there's a lot that you necessarily would need to change. I think it's clear. I think it's generally pretty clear. So on the balance, I think this falls kind of between the 5 and the 7, but I think it falls much closer to the 7. So I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. Thorough analysis. It's thorough, including a discussion of all applicable factors in all applicable cases. I'm going to say good on that one. It discusses all the factors, but McRae would really make this a better analysis. Covers both parties, absolutely. I'm sticking to that one. And so my comment is going to be the addition of McRae as a bookend case with Joseph would have made the analysis of the violence factors clearer and easier to understand. Nevertheless, the analysis was pretty clear with only Joseph. So that tells exactly what the issue is there. Okay, organization. The writer has used CREAC appropriately. Absolutely. This is a really nice clustered organization. The author does a very nice job of this. And this is very similar to what I drafted. Paragraph length. Again, the paragraph length is nice. Not too long, not too short. You got a reasonable number of paragraphs on each page. Generally 2 to 3 is what you're going for, but some of these are a little bit smaller, so it's okay. So I would say paragraph length is excellent. Organization facilitated the understanding. Yes, I think it did. I think the way that it was clustered, I think helps the reader understand the relationship between those factors. Clarity of writing. Oh, so let me make a comment about the organization. Organization was very clear and easy to follow. You used clusters well. It's a nice example. You're clearly doing a good job of understanding and executing the concepts that we're learning. Okay. And then finally, the clarity of the writing. Is it clear and simple? Yes, I felt like this was clear and simple. There were a couple of places where I think there was a comma error somewhere that would need to be cleaned up. But I mean, super, super minor, so I'd leave that alone. The document's been proofread carefully. Yes, I didn't notice any proofreading errors. There were some errors with the citations, but again, I don't want you guys to worry about that. I'll take a look at those things. Very easy to read and very clear and easy to read. Nice work. Okay. So then I'm going to save that. Oops. There we go. And it tells me that my review's been saved. And then if I go back to the timeline, it's going to give me another review to do. So I hope that was helpful to you in seeing how to do these reviews. Or if you've already done your reviews, in confirming that you did a nice, thorough, conscientious job of the reviews. And if you felt like you needed to tweak them based on what you saw in the videos, you still got some time to do that. Okay, let me know if you have any questions at all as you finish the review process in Peerceptiv and get ready to begin the final memo of the semester.